welcome to the Fieldhouse Podcast, Episode 3. I'm your host, Sam Vicini. It is Bracket Reveal Sunday here in Los Angeles and in New York, where my co-host here, Seth Davis, for the day, was there for the bracket reveal. The top 16 seeds have been chosen, at least in terms of where they stand right now on February 11th. So, Seth, before we get into that, how's it going, man? How is your day going up in New York?
It was gone. Listen, it's fun. I mean, I don't know if people think they like the idea of revealing the seeds this time of year, but it gets people talking about the tournament, and it's a nice window into the process and where things stand, and good piece of educating the public, which I think is always important. So it was a good preview, good rush to be on the show. Are you a fan generally of the fact that they do this now? Yeah, well, listen, anything that gets me more airtime, I'm generally in favor of. I honestly was not crazy about the idea when I first heard about it last year, partly because I've never really liked the way the football playoff committee does it. Yeah. It's really for a variety of reasons, but look, it's a one-time deal. You know, it is what it is, and you know, it's harder for college basketball, frankly, to get people's attention this time of year before the tournament. So anything that gets people talking and educates them on the process, I think, has been a pretty good thing.
Yeah, and it's perfectly timed. Just the week after the Super Bowl, it gets you a little bit more ingrained. You know, college basketball has a lot of fans that parachute in after the Super Bowl, want to see how their team is doing. I feel like it's a really nice way to kind of inform those fans where their team stands going forward into the future.
Yeah, and there's still, like, even just looking at my Twitter mentions coming off the show, I mean, there's so many misconceptions about how this all works, especially vis-a-vis the polls. Mm-hmm. And you try to explain to people that it is not their job to be an AP voter. You know, it is not their job to figure out, well, who are the top 25 teams moving forward. It's to, assess where things have gone down up to this point. It's a results-oriented process. So it's to the degree that we can explain that to people, they never seem to quite 100% get it, but it's important to at least try to explain it.
So what was your biggest takeaway? I guess is the best place to start. We'll kind of get into some of the other details, and for fans who are listening to the show later on, we're going to have Stew Mandel to kind of get into the nitty gritty of, some bubble teams and some top 16 stuff. But before we get there, I want to start with Seth. What was just your big picture takeaway of what you saw today?
Well, I think the interesting team here is Michigan State, because, this is a team that, I'm sure if you ask people who they think is going to win the championship, I'm sure a lot of people would probably pick the Spartans. I might be one of them. I'm not quite there yet, but obviously they had a great week and a great win over Purdue. And yet they pop up as a 3 seed. And, the thing is when you start peeling back their onion and you look at their results, it's very hard to find high-quality wins. The most obvious one was their neutral court win over North Carolina, and then they beat Purdue at home yesterday. And guess what, Sam? Those are their only 2 wins against teams that are ranked in the top 50 of the RPI. Yep. And if you look at what they have left, they've got 4 teams left. None of those teams are ranked in the top 50. In fact, only one of them is ranked in the top 100. So it's going to be hard for them. Now, if they win out and they win the Big Ten tournament, so they would have beaten, ostensibly, say, Ohio State and Purdue, then that will significantly bolster their resume. But that's the reality of this process. So they have, 2 top 50 wins. They have 3 what we're now calling quadrant 1 wins, which is wins against teams ranked in the top 30 at home, neutral court in the top 50, and road in the top 75 are being grouped into quadrant 1. They've got 3 of those if you include a win at Maryland. So, for a team that a lot of people would pick to win the championship and might assume would belong on that 1 line, it's a pretty thin resume.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I wasn't really surprised to see Michigan State on the 3 line because of that. I think people that live in this world have kind of been expecting that for a while. Now, did the Purdue win take them a little bit farther? I think it did, certainly. But as you mentioned, they only have 2 wins against top, 50 RPI teams right now. And it's worth mentioning, I think the committee will probably give the Notre Dame win that they had earlier in the season a bit more credence, given the fact that Bonzie Colson and Matt Farrell were there for that victory. But and everything needs contextualized, and the committee certainly does that. But at the end of the day, this is still a team where they have 3 quadrant 1 wins right now. They don't have any opportunities going forward for one. Let's say in the Big Ten tournament they get to 2 quadrant 1 wins, right? That would be equal to Gonzaga, who was not featured in the committee's top 16 right now. So it's really going to be tough for them to rack up the quadrant 1 wins, the high end wins that I think, maybe their talent level would think, people would think about with them, but to actually have their seeding match their talent level, I think it's going to be tough.
Yeah, and look, at a certain point, I mean, these other teams have to play games too, right? So I mean, Villanova and Xavier are going to play each other again, and so and Xavier's, that's a tough league. They could certainly lose a couple. Purdue could lose some more. So none of this is going to happen in a vacuum. But right now, I mean, they still have Kansas and Duke in front of them, and Auburn and Cincinnati are in front of them. And I don't see Cincinnati losing too many games between now and 4 weeks from today. But I mean, if Michigan State wins out and they win the Big Ten tournament, they're going to have a very compelling eye test argument, certainly to get to the 2 line. That would be a no-brainer. But for them to get to the 1 line, they're going to need some help from the teams ahead of them.
Yeah, I think that's true. Were there any other bigger surprises for you within the reveal?
I don't think so. I mean, look, Oklahoma was the last team in, so if you're going to quibble, that's the one you're going to quibble with, and they've lost 6 out of 8 here recently, so they're certainly not making a great case to be up. But they do have some pretty good wins, including a non-conference road win at Wichita State, and they beat USC. Technically, it was a neutral court game, but that was in Los Angeles. So they do have some quality wins. But listen, they got to play at Texas Tech, they got to play at Kansas, they got to play at Baylor. They're obviously not playing great right now. They're a young team, kind of hitting the wall and not really guarding. So one more loss and they would be off that 4 line. But otherwise, I think they got it pretty right.
So before we go further into the nitty-gritty, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you some of, your inside access here that you've had over the course of the last 24 hours into this process of seeding the teams, right? So last night you went out to dinner with Bruce Rasmussen and Dan Gavitt. Rasmussen is the committee chair this year, obviously. So what are some of the things you learned from getting to have a little bit more access to the people who ultimately got a chance to seed these teams today?
Well, a couple things. I mean, first of all, the big change for this year is this movement to the quadrants, and it's a little hard for me because it's my job to sit in a TV studio and explain it to people who don't follow it like you and I do, and do it in a very compressed amount of time. So when you say quadrant 1 win, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I still kind of revert to the top 50. But I think as time goes on, people will understand that. At first, I sort of felt like I understand why they did it, but I didn't think it would be that big of a deal because it's still the same information, right? I mean, they can look at someone's team sheet and see, they won a road game against, number 60 and understand the value of that without having to define it. But, I can tell you from, having dealt with these people and going through multiple mock drafts that, you're really bombarded with information. So when you fundamentally change the way that information is organized, I mean, it can make a pretty significant difference because at a certain point, you're trying to, get out of the trees and see the forest. And so you just kind of line up all the numbers. And it used to be top 50 wins, and now it's Q1 wins. And, that's gonna change how you think. So maybe that had a little bit more impact than I thought. One thing that I didn't know is they reach out by telephone after the selection show last year to either the coaches or I think more probably the athletic directors of the first 4 teams out. And then they also called a couple of schools that maybe there was some controversy around the seed. I think Wichita State they called last year to explain to them the reasons why the decisions got made. And I impressed upon them that if they're going to do that, then I would like them to reveal the content of that conversation to the public, maybe follow up with a public letter. They have no problem with the information being revealed. I just like them to be proactive, transparency. But I think that's a good mode of communication. And then, I kind of steered the conversation at dinner, Sam, towards the topic of this new metric that they're working on. They're actually working directly with folks at Google. Google's a new NCAA partner. And so the Google folks are trying to come on board to see if maybe there's a better way. I think it is a very dangerous and slippery slope if you start bringing in predictive models into this process because you are specifically including margin of victory. Now, This has been a long-standing conversation about, does a 30-point win count as much as a 2-point win? I mean, technically, no. I always say in the standings, if you beat a team by 1 or you beat them by 31, it counts as 1 win in the standings, and therefore it should count as 1 win in terms of the tournament. Now, obviously, there's a lot of subjectivity inside these numbers, so committee members are free to, allow that into their thinking. But when you bring margin of victory into your official metric for selecting and seeding the NCAA tournament, you're planting a seed. And, if you are the coach of a bubble team, if you're Kevin Keats, if you're Mike Anderson, if you're Konzo Martin, if you're Bruce Weber, and you find yourself in a situation in February and you're up by 8 points or 7 points with a minute to go, you might be thinking, hey, I got to try to stretch this thing out, because if I don't make the tournament this year, I'm going to get fired. And I just don't, maybe I'm overstating the concern. I just don't understand the drive towards that. So to the degree that you can maybe freshen up the RPI and modernize it, I'm all for it. I'm sure the folks at Google are a lot smarter than I am in terms of figuring out what those modifications should be. But, I mean, our guy, Ken Pomeroy, will tell you, I mean, he told the committee last year when they had that, what I affectionately call the Nerd Summit to go over all this stuff, he said to them, don't use my metric, because the Ken Pom ratings are predictive models, and their job in the committee is to determine who has earned their spot into the bracket and at what seed. So that's going to be a very, very interesting process and conversation, because by next year they are going to have a new overall metric, which again is simply used as an organizing tool for all this information.
Well, yeah, I mean, I pretty strongly agree with the idea of using margin of victory, to be honest. I do think that there are ways to work around the circumstances that you kind of laid out, right? Where you can find ways to exclude garbage time moments, right? You can find ways to exclude things like that. Like, for instance, there's a website called Cleaning the Glass that Ben Falk, the former director of analytics for the Philadelphia 76ers, runs, where he uses numbers that essentially take out garbage time and do stuff like that. And we live in the era of big data. I think we can find a way to, more maturely use margin of victory within these numbers. And, I think that those circumstances where there are moments at the end of games where teams are trying to figure out, okay, do we run this up? Do we not run this up? I mean, I'm all for teams continuing to play as much as they can and continuing to, do what they can to win by their true talent levels. I think that shows the true measure of a team in many ways by getting more possessions and more chances to see what a team can do at the end of the day. So I'd be all for margin of victory.
Let me ask you this question, because you're a lot better at this stuff and smarter about this stuff than I am. What exactly is wrong with the RPI?
I actually don't know. That's a good question off the top of my head. I would have to look at the the formula for it.
The formula, it's 25% a team's record, it's 50% their opponent's record, and it's 25% their opponent's record. Mm-hmm. So people don't like it, they say, because you're using 75% of
that's right,
opponent's information as opposed to the teams. But I mean, I always say, the people, the Scott Van Pelts of the world, or the people who say they don't like it. Well, show me your bracket. Like, don't talk to me about the RPI and formulas and this and that. Like, show me how this is really going to be all that different of a result of a bracket. And I have yet to find anybody who's going to do that. So I'm just, I'm just curious as to where all this drive for change is. Probably inside baseball, people just want to fill out a bracket and watch the games. But it's certainly been a driving point of conversation in our world.
Well, the other part of this is that it doesn't account for road and neutral, correct?
Well,
it's just accounting for winning percentage.
A road win is, I think, like 1.3, and home is 0.7. So it's baked into the RPI.
Yeah, so I guess that...
I don't understand why they want to even do the quadrant thing. I'm like, I thought you already handled this by baking it into the RPI. It's like we're always trying to change things and tweak things and modernize things, and sometimes it's like, well, why don't you just leave well off? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But what do I know? Yeah,
for me, I do agree with the idea of putting in margin of victory first and foremost. I am a fan of trying to reduce the amount of opponent strength of schedule within the RPI. It's what, like it's 2/3 opponent winning percentage and then like 1/3 opponents winning percentage, right? It's something like that where the calculation comes into play.
50 and 75. 50 opponents, 25 opponents.
Right. So I would like to reduce the amount that kind of stuff comes into play. But at the end of the day, I don't think I'm not as like so far against the RPI as a lot of people are. Like, I think it's a piece of the puzzle, but I think we should continue to use all of the pieces of the puzzle to find a way to, find commonality here, because I actually don't. I understand that Ken has said not to use his formula. I don't agree with that, even so, because, I think, again, it can be 1/10 of what we're accounting for, right? It doesn't have to be the be-all, end-all in how you seed teams, right? It can be 1/20th. It can be whatever factor you want it to be. But I do think that, having a predictive model formula in there, it does go to show who the best teams are in some regard. And it doesn't have to be the entire deal, but it should be at least a piece of the puzzle to me.
Well, keep in mind, though, the members of the committee have been looking at Ken Palm's ratings for years.
Right.
The Sagarin ratings for years, and the BPI, whatever that is. They have all of those metrics.
Right.
And I actually think that they use it properly. They don't use it to say, okay, who's the better team? They're just looking for outliers, right? So if they're saying, like Wichita State was the classic example last year where I think they were like 10th overall in Ken Palm, overall in the country last year in Ken Palm's ratings on Selection Sunday, and yet, there was some doubt as to whether they would have gotten an at-large if they had lost in their conference tournament, and they end up as a 10 seed.
So, I can give you the exact numbers on Wichita. It was number 5 in the country, and they had like 2 top 50 wins or 3 top 50 wins, twice over Illinois State and 1 over Oklahoma.
There you go. So, there was a big gap between where they were sort of going in the seeding and where Ken Palm had them. So all that means is the committee member is going to look at those numbers and say, well, why is that gap there? And then they're going to dig in. So it gives them some red flag. They've been looking at all of the metrics all of these years. So it's not like they're ignoring them. It's not like they're not in the process. It's just they feel the need to bake this into their RPI, which is really, and that's another thing, is I think people look at a team's RPI rank as if that's significant, and it's not. They're never, oh, well, this team, okay, we're looking at 2 teams. Well, one of them is 41 in the RPI and the other one is 54 in the RPI. Therefore, we're going to vote in 41. That's not how it works at all. They're going to look at inside the numbers, how you did against what used to be the top 50 now is quadrant 1. So I just think a lot of this is very, very, the amount of time, and here we've devoted this whole podcast to it, I think we should move on, but amount of time that people devote to this part of the process, and now the amount of time they're devoting to trying to do this part of the process differently, I think is not commensurate with how it's actually applied. Yeah, no, the
RPI is just used to sort, basically. It's a sorting tool. That's the best way to put it. Like, it just sorts the team sheets into things, or into, more breakdownable places. Right? Like, just an easier way to go about sorting through information. But let's move on. You're right. This has been way too long of a conversation on just the nitty gritty that people don't care about. The couple of things that people do care about. What happened in college basketball yesterday? Seth, what was the most important thing you saw in college basketball yesterday?
Well, I'll say what Gonzaga did to poor St. Mary's. They jumped on them that was a classic example of just a team losing the game at home and having a long time to hear about it and react to it and adjust to it and think about it. And they came out royally pissed off, and they jumped St. Mary's. And it's really why, I've been so hot and cold on St. Mary's all season long, but it is why you worry about them in a tournament setting, because once they face a team that's more athletic than they are and quicker than they are and can disrupt the rhythm offensively, then they're toast. And Gonzaga absolutely dominated them. Obviously, you got to be impressed with Michigan State being able to win at home over Purdue. I think those are two really good teams. But when you think about Michigan State, everything that they've been through and having to deal with, with the Larry Nassar situation and all the fallout, the fact that they haven't lost since that all happened is, from a basketball standpoint, pretty impressive. So I think a lot of people would probably make them their favorite to win the championship.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out the Texas Tech Kansas kind of deal that happened yesterday. So Texas Tech goes on the road and just beats the heck out of a pretty solid Kansas State team that I think is going to have a chance to make the NCAA tournament at the end of the day. Keenan Evans goes for 19. Jair Smith and Jarrett Culver have continued to just be absolutely remarkable. And then in addition to that, Kansas actually goes on the road and loses by 16 to Baylor, which is not a great loss in my opinion. You look at where we're going here with Kansas down the stretch. Texas Tech is up a game right now. They're projected by Ken Pomeroy, to bring this conversation full circle, to win the Big 12 outright. Kansas, remaining, has a road game at Iowa State, who proved pretty frisky yesterday against Oklahoma, winning by 8. They have a home game against West Virginia, home game against Oklahoma, road at Texas Tech, home against Texas, road against an Oklahoma State team that has already beaten them at Fog Allen Fieldhouse. This might be the year, really, where Kansas's streak ends. I think we're at that point where we can start to significantly wonder if this is going to happen.
Well, I mean, I think the chances are that it's going to, not least because Texas Tech gets them in Lubbock and they already beat them in Allen Fieldhouse. And if you look at all the trend lines at Kansas, Sam, I know you follow this stuff very closely. I mean, they're going the wrong way here. I keep saying, I'm sure Silvio DeSouza isn't like the second coming of Hakeem Olajuwon, but they went through an awful lot of trouble to get that kid eligible. I mean, he literally, he doesn't play. He's not in the game at all. He's not. I mean, they were getting their butts kicked on the boards against Oklahoma State, which is no great team, and Self couldn't even put him in the game.
Yeah.
So I just don't know that they are wired for that, and it really does expose, even though they've lost a lot of games at home, which we're not used to seeing, it really exposes them on the road, because on the road it's harder to make outside shots. It's just not as comfortable an environment to be shooting, and they become very dependent on the 3-point shot. And then Baylor, throws that zone up at them, so now it's that much harder to drive to the rim and finish around the rim. I mean, Baylor was pretty much in control of that game wire to wire. So I actually think that Kansas is not going to win the Big 12, that their streak is going to get snapped, but I also think that's the least of their problems.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I do think that Texas Tech is going to win the Big 12. Maybe Kansas gets a share, but Texas Tech to me has been the best team in that league so far, and I agree with you that Kansas is flawed. They have some pretty real defensive issues. I mean, Baylor came into that game yesterday without exactly terrific offense. They're still ranked 58th in adjusted offensive efficiency, even after dropping 80 and 65 possessions against Kansas. This is a team that just cannot really defend the interior in the same way that Bill Self teams typically defend the interior. So I'm concerned about Kansas. I think this could be an early out in the NCAA tournament.
I think so. And by the way, keep your eye on Texas Tech as a potential 1 seed.
Yep.
They're going to need some help above them. But, right now, the committee had them on the 3 line. But as I say, they've got the inside track here. They got Kansas at home. Kansas is ahead of them on the seed line right now. So if they beat Kansas a second time, at the very least, they've got to be ahead of Kansas, and that would put them right. So if they can finish the job and win the Big 12 tournament, I mean, how about that for Chris Beard and the job that he's done if Texas Tech ends up as a 1 seed? It's very possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be remarkable if Chris Beard wins the Big 12, breaks the streak outright, and doesn't win National Coach of the Year, which I think legitimately might happen, and it wouldn't be all that crazy. Yeah,
no, it's an interesting Coach of the Year race. I mean, you got some good candidates. Chris Holtman, Tony Bennett are the other 2 that come to mind for me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, what Beard has done, and done it, by the way, on a torn ACL, which is maybe the most impressive of all.
Seth, I'm going to let you get out of here. We're going to bring in Stew Mandel. Do you have any other points you want to make real quick?
No, it's going to be fun. 4 weeks from today is Selection Sunday, man. Can't believe it. Can't wait.
All right, Seth, thanks. Just wait here 1 second, and we'll be back in a minute with Stew Mandel. All right, we're here now with Stew Mandel, as promised. Stu, how you going, man?
I'm doing well, Sam. How are you?
I'm all right. You're finally getting back into college basketball season. You had a great first year at the All-American over at the Athletic. Did you enjoy your first year here?
I really did. It was really cool to bring something to life, just like you guys have done on the basketball side. And so far, obviously, the feedback is good. People seem to be enjoying what we're doing. So it's been a really rewarding experience.
That's awesome. But now we're into college basketball season, and I don't know if people keep track of this stuff, but if I remember correctly, you are among the top 3 or 4 bracketologists in terms of accuracy over the last few years, right?
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to bring that up because then this will be the year that the law of averages comes in. But yes, the last 3 years at Fox, on the site Bracket Matrix, I was number 2 overall.
Yeah, I'm always the same way with mock draft stuff. I'm just yeah, I've been really good in the past, but do I really want to bring this up now and jinx it? So we're going to talk to Stew about the top 16 reveals. We talked about Seth at the top of the show, and then we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty stuff on some of the bubble teams and some of the teams that may not necessarily know where their status stands. So the first question I want to ask you, Stew, is just generally, what was your impression of the top 16?
My impression was that for the most part, we saw a pretty strong correlation with the new emphasis on the team sheets are now, instead of just straight up RPI 1 to 50, they're now using these quadrant systems that reward road and neutral wins more. And so I think teams like Kansas, that's why you saw them as high as you did, or UNC, and conversely why Michigan State was lower than people might think. The one exception, I think the team that surprised me the most was Cincinnati. They don't really have great wins like a lot of these other teams, but they do obviously rank very high on sites like KenPom. So they seem to be the one team the committee treated at least a little bit differently than the others.
The weird thing with Cincinnati is that they are 4-2 in quadrant 1, but they're 8-0 in quadrant 2 and don't have any quadrant 3 and 4 losses. So I don't really it's still hard for me to get a grasp on just how much emphasis is going on quadrant 1 versus quadrant 2 and 3, because all the quadrants, basically, what emphasis is going where. The reason I say that is if they were really, it seems like with Kansas and Oklahoma, they emphasize strongly quadrant 1 wins. That's why those teams rank as highly as they do. But in the case of Cincinnati and in the case of Gonzaga, for instance, who has 5 quadrant 1 wins, it doesn't seem like those were emphasized as much as with a Kansas and with an Oklahoma. So I'm still trying to piece it all together too,
Well, I think with Cincinnati, if you just go by that number, the 4-2 number in Q1, I mean, that's not bad. But who are those for? Their best wins are over Houston. Yep. Those wins are over Houston, Buffalo, and Temple. Houston's the only one. And UCLA, yes, and those are the only ones that Houston would be the only one that right now would be a definite at-large team for me, and even then it would be pretty low. So it's not like these are great wins individually, but if they're just looking at that column and saying, 5-2 Q1, that's a good record, then I guess I understand that.
Yeah. The other one that kind of stood out to me was Duke ahead of North Carolina. North Carolina has more quadrant 1 wins, more quadrant 2 wins, and has beaten Duke head-to-head now, obviously, after this week. It does seem like to me that maybe the committee has put a pretty significant emphasis on that loss at home to Wofford, to have them as a number 3 versus, Duke as a number 2. What were kind of your thoughts on Duke ahead of North Carolina, since I'm sure everyone on Tobacco Road was going crazy when they saw that result?
Yeah, a little surprised that Duke is still as high as they are after this week. But at the same time, I think it's kind of what you said. You look at Duke; they have 5 losses, and even the one that you would say is a bad loss at BC, they're 81st in RPI, so that's only considered a Q2 loss. I'm still getting used to this terminology, by the way, as I'm sure everybody else is as well. So you can't really say that they have a bad loss, but you can definitely say that with UNC with the home loss against Wofford.
Yeah, so it's going to be weird. It's going to be kind of, growing throughout for us, right? We're still going to be figuring out how to do this as the tournament committee comes down to it in March. So let's kind of go to the next step here. Now that you've started bracketing these teams, what has been the biggest thing that stood out to you outside of the top 16, or maybe including those, but just an overarching kind of idea of, where college basketball stands this year?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more muddled than maybe some of the seasons I've done in the past. Obviously Virginia and Villanova, even after losses this week, have separated themselves. But once you get much past that, I think Xavier obviously has put themselves in that discussion as well. But you start talking about teams like Purdue, Auburn, Kansas, Duke, Clemson, Texas Tech. We could move those teams around in pretty much any order.
Yep.
I don't feel like you look at that and you obviously know who's going to be the, I didn't know going into today who would be the 4th 1 seed. I was obviously very certain about Virginia, Villanova, Xavier. But if they had said Purdue, which they did, okay. If they had said Auburn, if they had said Kansas, if they had said any number of teams, it would have been they could have made an argument for it. So there's not as much separation at the top as maybe we've seen in the past. Of course, that could still happen over the rest of the season.
Yeah, and just kind of looking through the bubble, I think it's equally as muddled a mess, right? Like you're trying to sort through. I mean, I think in your first bracket you had like South Carolina as one of your first 4 out, and you had Boise State very close, and you had Western Kentucky as one of your last 4 in. It's a really tricky year, I think, to figure out where all these teams slot in because everyone is so close to one another.
I mean, I feel like we say this every year, but when you get down and you're trying to get those last 4 in, and even, I'm not doing I do a first 4 out. I'm not doing a next 4 out because there just aren't that many teams worth putting in that column. So it's pretty slim pickings. Marquette was in my bracket at one point. They're 13 and 11. You mentioned South Carolina. Now I will say one team that's helped themselves off of that is Virginia Tech.
Yeah,
that's a team that was right. I think they were my first team out last week. Obviously, biggest win in the country this week, so they'll be considerably higher when I do the next one. But those have been exceptions. For the most part, it seems like teams like USC, for example, have been doing their best to play themselves off of the bracket.
Let's start there. Let's start with USC because they lose their last 3 games to UCLA, Arizona State, Arizona. That was really their 3 big chances to come up with quadrant 1 wins that could have made a difference. Now, 4 of their last 5 games have a chance to be against quadrant 2 teams, which could help them going forward. Could really, if they can win 5 of those games, they can win 4 of their last 5. I think they can probably get themselves back on the right side of the bubble. But USC is in an interesting spot to me. Where would you have them right now?
I'd have them in that first 4 out group right now. I think when I did the first one a couple weeks ago, they were a little more safely in, and then they fell into the first or the last 4 in. Now they'd be in the first 4 out. It really isn't much of a resume when you look at it. The 2 top wins are against mid-majors, Middle Tennessee, New Mexico State. I think we both agree those are good teams, but not the glamorous wins that maybe the committee's looking for. So, like you said, not a lot of chances to post those big wins. It's probably for them a matter of at least holding serve down the stretch and then getting into the Pac-12 tournament and beating an Arizona or an Arizona State, somebody that can show up in that first column. Because once you get down to the bubble teams, this is my experience in the past, it actually doesn't take that much to, you get to the end of the season, you're just looking for somebody to step up and make that case. And it could be as simple as, well, they got their 3rd. In the past, this would have been 3rd top 50 win. Okay, that's enough.
How difficult does it get to try and parse through the Pac-12 and the Big Ten whenever both of those leagues this year have been very much a have and a have-not league, right? Like the Pac-12, you can basically point to Arizona, Arizona State, and maybe USC, UCLA, and Washington, depending on the day, in terms of good wins. In the Big Ten, it's been, Purdue, Michigan State, Ohio State, certainly, Michigan, and then the rest is kind of a muddled mess. How do you kind of parse through those leagues whenever they're so top heavy and, all of their fans are saying, but we're going to finish 4th in the Big Ten. How much does that stuff matter?
Yeah, it's a pretty meaningless stat. if you actually look at an NCAA team sheet, it doesn't say anywhere where they are, conference standing or anything like that. So it's weird to see the Big Ten in this state. I mean, I feel like it was only a few years ago we were talking about them as the best conference in the country. It shows how these things go in cycles, because the SEC was a laughingstock for so long in basketball, and they have a chance to send maybe 8 teams this year. So with the Big Ten, it's frankly pretty clear cut. You've got 3 really good teams that are playing. We saw some games between them this week. Gives those teams a chance to improve their resume when they beat each other. But beyond that, there's not much those teams can do by beating a Penn State or an Indiana or Northwestern and so on. And the team that I think you may be alluding to there is Nebraska. Their fans are seeing that record get better and better, 10-4 in the conference now, and saying, why aren't we showing up on these mock brackets? And it's just it's all empty calories. They don't have the resume at all. So it's I say to people all the time, it's not what's your record, it's who you beat, and they just don't have that right now.
How far would Nebraska be off of your board right now in terms of your bracket? Like how far do they need to go to get to the point where they would be considered in for you?
To this point, I haven't even really had them in serious consideration. That a home win over Michigan is the entirety of their resume. So I think to get into the discussion, they would need to add another Q1 win, and at that point, maybe I can take them a little bit more seriously. But it's not just that. It's a 2-pronged problem: lack of high-end wins, and then non-conference schedule strength. And we see this every year. A team that's considered right on the bubble gets left out because their non-conference strength of schedule, in this case, is 261st. The committee does not like that and wants to send a message about the importance of scheduling strong. So it's hard for me to take them seriously right now because they just don't have either of those things.
So kind of going from the weaker leagues up to the stronger leagues, you mentioned the SEC potentially getting as many as 8 teams in. What teams from the SEC would you feel, at least on the bubble, which ones would you feel most confident about right now?
Well, in the last couple weeks, Texas A&M, I feel like, played themselves out of the bubble. Missouri, Missouri's probably still considered a bubble team, but I feel like with each week they're getting closer to being able to say they're solidly in. I think, and the opposite of that would be Georgia has just kind of played themselves out of the conversation. So the one team that's probably sitting there definitively on the bubble is Mississippi State, and I would not have them in right now, but they're close. They would be, if not first 4 out, then pretty close to that.
It's interesting. I really hadn't considered Mississippi State as a potential NCAA tournament team all year. I just have watched them a couple times now and probably seen their worst games, because I saw them play Alabama on the road, and I saw them play Cincinnati and just get demolished, and Florida on the road and just get absolutely demolished. How much do their lack of road wins really hinder them?
It's a big problem. 1-6 on the road with 1 neutral court win on top of that. We know that the committee's looking for that. They also have even worse non-conference schedule strength than Nebraska. Now, what they do have is 3 of those Q1 wins, although they're all at home: Missouri, Alabama, Arkansas. And it's like I said, when you get down to team number 68, that can often be enough. Now, I think they're going to need to do more to compensate for that non-conference. Basically, when you're a team that has the number 300 non-conference record or non-conference strength of schedule, you need to be comfortably in. You don't want to put your fate in the hands of the committee, because they're always going to rule against those teams.
Does Alabama have one of the weirder resumes that you can remember?
Yeah, they're one of those teams. We see these, we see a team like this pretty much every year that's all over the map. Another good example of that this year is Washington, which has some absolutely fantastic wins and some awful wins, or some awful losses. But in Alabama's case, I think they're starting to stack them up at this point in terms of high-end wins, 6, I believe. So, 6 Q1 wins, that's a lot. So it's going to help balance out some of the bad losses.
So kind of going from the SEC now and moving into the Big 12. The Big 12, I think, all year has been considered probably the strongest league, top to bottom, in the entire country. How do you feel about the Big 12 and how it stacks up in terms of NCAA tournament bids to the rest of the country?
Well, the Big 12, it's been fascinating just this week to watch, even the teams that you don't currently have in there. And I had 7 of the 10 teams in as of the last bracket. And of those other 3, Baylor posts a huge win, makes you think maybe we should be talking about them. Oklahoma State, Iowa State with a huge win this week, obviously. So to me, 7's the minimum for the Big 12. And the question is, can the right team, can a Baylor get hot and put together enough resume to make 8? And you think about that, 8 out of 10 teams making the tournament would be insane. I think the Big 12 the last few years, I don't know if it goes all the way back to when they went to 10 teams, but at least in the last few years, they've been very deep. And kind of the benefit of, if you have a good league and you play a round-robin schedule where everybody plays each other twice, and we know the emphasis on top 50 or now Q1 wins, there's so many opportunities to get those. I remember a few years ago, Texas got into the tournament, and they were, I want to say, 2-10 against the top 50, but they just kept getting those chances, and they eventually got enough wins.
Baylor is a really interesting one to me just because you look at their resume. They have wins against Creighton on a neutral floor. They beat Kansas on Saturday. They have a win against Texas as well. I would imagine they still have to do quite a bit more to get onto your radar at 15-10, but how close are they?
Well, frankly, they weren't close at all prior to this week, but the Kansas win is the kind of win that suddenly vaults you into contention. It's just it's like I said, down in that territory of teams where you're just looking for anybody to give you some reason to include them. One big win like that can send a team just soaring up my list. But right now they are 2-8 Q1. That's not good. Yeah. To balance out the 8, they probably need to. I feel better if that said 4-8 at the end of the season than 2-8.
Certainly. The ACC to me has been one of the worst ACC years I can remember. Do you kind of feel that way, that this is a down ACC?
Yeah, it doesn't. It certainly doesn't feel as deep. I mean, ever since they went to 15 teams, it just and especially when the old Big East disintegrated, it felt like this was just every year was just going to be a given that this is always the strongest league. And obviously, we don't necessarily feel that's the case this year. You look at a team like Syracuse that's sitting right around the middle of the pack with a decent record on the surface, and you open up that resume and there's just nothing there. And that's not, we're not talking about the past couple of years when Syracuse was in the mix to get the 11th ACC bid. This is more like, could they be one of the 7 or 8?
Yeah, no, you look at Syracuse, I mean, their best win is probably Louisville on the road. And then after that, either Virginia Tech at home. It's probably Virginia Tech at home or Maryland at home, right?
So Syracuse is another team. We mentioned this with Cincinnati earlier, where technically their best RPI win is Buffalo. Buffalo just keeps sneaking up into everybody's resumes with the number 32 in front of them. So it's Buffalo and Louisville are the 2 in that quadrant. Virginia Tech is now 56th, so because it was at home, that's considered Q2. But
yeah,
if they continue to play well, they're going to move up. That's certainly going to help them. Syracuse makes it tough on the committee every year by not playing road games very much. So
right.
3-4 on the road. That's not really going to help their case, but they do have a very, very strong schedule. So schedule strength. So it's just a matter of getting a couple more and trying to compensate, obviously, for losses to Wake and Georgia Tech.
In the Big East, Providence seems like it's probably relatively close to the bubble. Marquette probably relatively close to the bubble. Other than that, though, it seems relatively cut and dry. Xavier, Villanova, Creighton, Butler, it feels like should all feel pretty good about where they're standing.
Yeah, Seton Hall as well.
Yeah.
Butler, I kind of thought was on the bubble when I first started doing this a couple weeks ago, and now you see, actually they're pretty comfortably in.
Yeah, I mean, the wins over Ohio State and Villanova, I think, are the pretty big boosts there that they're going to get. Mm-hmm. Providence and Marquette, though, are interesting. Providence, obviously, has the gaudy record against the Big East so far. What are your thoughts on the Friars? It seems like they're coming in late up until that loss on Saturday to DePaul and really starting to push, bracketologists to include them.
Well, I had them as a 10 seed, and I wasn't really thinking much in terms of are they in danger until they add really that's their second bad home loss this season if you also include Minnesota, and then a really, really bad loss in the 200s at UMass. It's weird. I feel like Providence, this was the exact same formula last year where they had the high-end wins and the really bad losses. But those are 4 really good wins at the top of the resume, and Xavier, Creighton, Butler, neutral site against Washington. The road win at Marquette right now would qualify as Q1. So I do think they have enough good wins to keep them, I wouldn't say relatively safe, but probably not necessarily one of those last 4 spots, not in the play-in game.
Let's kind of move on just to some of the mid-majors. Every year the conversation happens, should more mid-majors get into the big dance? And, to me, I always kind of side with them. I always find myself believing that, I want to see more of these guys get their chance against the big boys. We've seen, Texas, you mentioned, the year they went 2-10 against the top 50. I would rather see a team that goes 2-1 against the top 50 get in, or 1-1 against the top 50 get in, just because they didn't necessarily have the chance. So, are there any mid-majors this year that stand out to you, or even like, Mountain West, AAC schools that have a really legitimate case?
Oh, so in the case of Boise State, and I don't know if we consider they would not be considered mid-major in football anymore, but I guess they are still in basketball in the Mountain West. The committee says they want you to go play good teams in the non-conference. They certainly thought they were doing that by going on the road and playing an Oregon team that was in the Final Four last year. But Oregon's only 82 right now in the RPI, so that doesn't get into their Q1. And so as a result, you're sitting here looking at a Boise State team that has a decent record, 20-5, and people think is pretty good. And in that Q1 column is empty. There's no wins up there. And that's the challenge every year, when you say, there should be more mid-major teams included. A lot of times the teams that get left out are teams like this, where the committee just wants to see something. They need give us 2 top 50 or 2 Q1 wins. Give us something to justify putting them in. Right now it's not there. I would have loved to have seen, if this committee reveal had gone a little bit further than 16, I would have loved to have seen where Rhode Island and St. Mary's were, because those are both teams that don't have the big wins that would wow people for the most part, but have great records and have been very high in the traditional polls, obviously. I have a feeling those would qualify as teams that will be ranked, that will be seated lower than the AP poll has them, but you just never know for sure. And then it would be interesting. I think the team that would be, for just going a little bit further down the list of conferences, the team that would be really interesting to see what they would do with if they weren't an automatic bid team is Middle Tennessee. Yeah. Because I think just college basketball fans would say, of course, they're one of the, they're deserving of an at-large bid. But again, there's a big, they've won Q1 win at Western Kentucky. So that's the team that would probably be discussed if they don't win their tournament, and as well as teams I mentioned before.
You also mentioned Western Kentucky in there. They have the big win against Purdue, the neutral win against SMU. Sitting at 10-2, they don't have a ton of terrible losses in the Conference USA or anything. I believe that you had them as one of your last 4 out in your first bracket. Do you think they still have any chance at an at-large if they can, kind of navigate the rest of their terrible schedule going forward?
Yeah, it's not looking good because when they lost, I think right after I did the first one, they lost at UTSA, who at the time was in the 200s. I'm looking now, they're 199. So that's their 4th loss to a team ranked below 100. Yeah, and that's going to be a problem. Now, the Purdue win is great. There's no question about it. But beyond that, there's not much for them to brag about. So I think Middle Tennessee might have that at-large case, but I think Western Kentucky's probably got to get the automatic.
And then the last one I want to ask you about is St. Bonaventure. They have that terrible stretch where they lose 4 of 5 games. They do lose to Niagara early in the season without Jalen Adams. They lose to TCU by 10 on a neutral. Is there any chance, I've seen them kind of pop up in these discussions as well, is there any chance you think that they can find a way to sneak in?
Maybe. You're right. That's a team that I've seen all over the map. I've seen people have them in. I've seen people that don't think they should even be in the conversation. They would have probably qualified as my next 4 out as of last week. And they do have 3 Q1 wins, but it kind of like one of the teams I was talking about earlier. These are not glamorous wins.
USC.
These are at Buffalo, at Syracuse. Yeah, exactly. And neutral Vermont. Yeah, exactly. Kind of like the USC one, except USC doesn't have these, losses to Niagara and St. Joe's and whatnot. So, obviously the conference is rated a little bit higher. I think the best thing that could happen to them, honestly, would be, get a chance to beat Rhode Island. That's the one team that,
yep.
You're going to, if you can win that, you're going to make a huge dent in your resume.
Yep, that happens on Friday the 16th, so that'll be a really interesting game to track going forward. Stu, is there any other kind of overarching, thing that we didn't talk about here that you find interesting within the bracketing process this year?
Well, you've got several teams where there's a discrepancy between RPI and KenPom. And in the past, I would say I use KenPom a little bit when it gets to the bubble teams. We have seen examples of a team like UCLA a couple years ago where that was really kind of the only explanation for how they got in. But I wouldn't use it much with seeding at all. But now for this year, for the first time, it's sitting right there at the top of the team sheet. It says their RPI ranking, says their KenPom, I think BPI, Sagarin. So what I'm prepared for, frankly, is myself and a lot of bracketologists to be very wrong this year because things have changed. This is our first time dealing with these new team sheets, and you can't necessarily use the past as an exact prediction for this year. Now, I will say, like we said earlier, right off the top 16 today did, for the most part, correlate pretty strongly with their traditional RPI data, but Cincinnati being that high, tells me they looked at KenPom and saw Cincinnati's 4th overall, has this defense that if it weren't for Virginia, we'd be talking about Cincinnati's defense as being historically dominant. So that one, I think that one went beyond Q1, Q2, etc.
It's going to be really interesting to track. Stu, tell the people about what you've got coming up at the All-American, what you've got coming up with doing some college basketball work throughout the course of the next month or so.
Well, for college basketball, I'm doing a new bracket every Tuesday on the Fieldhouse throughout February, and that'll become more frequent once we get into early March. On the college football side, I still write my mailbag every Wednesday, and it's not just me on the All-American. We got a great team of writers. We have 6 other writers who are out there. We are not taking we don't do an off-season. They're out there reporting stories as we speak.
Yeah, you do have a great staff over there. It's been great to see you guys have some success early in the year. This has been the Fieldhouse Podcast. Please subscribe to us over on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Android, whatever podcasting app you use. I'm sure we're up on there right now. We'll have Stu on later on as the bracket gets closer, and we'll have Seth on every Sunday, and we'll have something later in the week with some of the great contributors over at the Fieldhouse. So until next time, thanks. Bye.